Hey and welcome back to Fanfic Reading. Today we are reading How It Feels by Raalm and ToxicExotic. I hope you enjoy.
Chapter 4, Doubtful Rose. It didn't mean anything, Ruby sighed inwardly as she walked down the hallway after her training with Blake. While the training had been little more than a waste of time, the events that followed were most certainly confusing her, and ever since leaving the room, she had been in a constant argument with herself. She was just being kind. But she doesn't hug anyone. She hugs Yang. Yang hugs her. She just kinda stands there awkwardly. Ugh. Shut up, stupid brain. Raising her hand to her head in a foolish hope that the pressure would make it stop trying to convince her of something that wouldn't happen. As expected, it didn't help in the slightest, so reaching into her bag, she pulled out her favorite pair of headphones and slipped them over her ears, turning her music up to max to block out the thoughts that had been hounding her ever since the talk with the fetching faunus. Fortunately, the punk rock helped quite a bit as the bass pulsed through her. Letting out a small sigh, she pushed open the door to Beacon's courtyard and quickly found her favorite bench and sat down to think on the more important things that had happened during their training. The smell of roses from a nearby bush permeating the air and providing the comfort of the fond memories associated with the smell. It was very rare that she lost her temper in such a way, anger being more Yang and their father's thing than hers, but she had certainly felt it brewing for the last couple of weeks. Constantly losing in class and making mistake after mistake had been causing her quite a bit of the doubt of whether being a huntress, like her mom, really was what she was meant to do, doubts she cast aside when Ashvin allowed her into the school early. She still wasn't sure why he had done that though. There were plenty of people in her year back at Signal that frequently beat her in fair combat, so it couldn't have been due to her skill. Everyone there also had the same goal of protecting people, so it couldn't have been that either. Was it simply that she was in the right place at the right time? Did Ashvin know something she didn't? He always acted like he did, so it would hardly be a surprise to her. Or was Blake right? Did Ashvin think that she was the type of girl to inspire others? But how did she do that? She never did anything that plenty of others didn't do. All she ever did was try and be as good a person as she could. But could that really be all that's needed to inspire someone? You inspired Blake. Once again, her brain pushed through the music to bring the girl back to the forefront of her memories, though thankfully, it was at least pertinent to what she was thinking about for once. Did I? Ruby asked herself as she span around to lay on the bench with her eyes closed. She was already becoming a huntress to help people. She said you did? But how? Ruby thought and wrapped her cloak over her as the slight wind caused bumps to raise on her arms. It doesn't really help to know that I did it without knowing how. Maybe that's the point. That doesn't help. Sighing at how useless her own mind could be sometimes, she once again let herself fall back into enjoying her music. It wasn't very often that she was able to enjoy her music, as Weiss often scolded her for playing it loud, and having the burden of being the team leader meant she was having to pay attention at all times. So the rare 5 minutes where she was able to relax and listen to her tunes were treasured greatly. However, as it had done the day before, and almost every time she closed her eyes as let her mind drift, the image of Blake floated into the center of her mind. It was never an image of anything special, never of the girl fighting or doing something that normal people would get stuck in their head, but simply the image of her reading. While usually it was a book while sitting in her own bed, for the past 2 days, it had been the image of them sat together on hers, enjoying the manga and eating cookies. As she had suspected that night, very little of the manga actually registered, as the majority of the time was spent sneaking as many glances as she could at the gorgeous girl, not to mention that every time Blake reached into the bag for a cookie, her fingers would graze along her side for the briefest of seconds. Every time it happened, her mind would spin in circles, causing her to lose where she was on the page, and not wanting to hold Blake up, she would give a simple nod whenever the girl asked if she was done. Maybe she was doing it on purpose. That's stupid, she scoffed internally as she put her hands banging her head to aid against the hard metal bench, though even she could admit that Blake had eaten more cookies that night than Ruby had ever seen her eat before. Why would she do that? Maybe she likes spending time with you. As friends. Maybe more? That's even more stupid, she sighed at the silly idea her brain had just come up with. She doesn't feel the way I do. But what if she did? Then she would still be Yang's best friend. Ruby groaned and turned her head to the side and opened her eyes to watch the rest of the students enjoy their free time, her eyes locking onto a couple who were laying on the grass in each other's arms. We could never have that. Apparently her brain had no response as nothing but music replied, and feeling herself becoming slightly more miserable from watching the couple, she turned back to look at the sky and was met by a pair of lilac eyes gazing down at her and blocking out the darkening sky. Feeling the blonde hair that was dangling from the girl's head tickled her nose, she reached up and batted it away as her sister's mouth moved, the words lost to the music. "What's up?" she asked, pulling one side of the headphones off her ears. "I asked you what's up," Yang repeated as her hand came out to tap her legs, indicating for her to move them. Letting out a sigh, she folded her legs and Yang effortlessly vaulted over the bench to sit down, Ruby unfolding her legs to rest them on her sister. "You look sad." "Just thinking about things," Ruby replied dismissively with a shrug, reaching up to turn her headphones off and moving them to hang around her neck. "Anything your big sis can help with?" "I doubt it." Ruby shook her head, feeling Yang gently knead her legs in a soothing massage. "How are Coco and Velvet? I thought you were spending the day together?" "They had to go to a meeting with Port about their upcoming mission," Yang replied, and Ruby could tell there was at least a little worry in her voice. "They get to spend a week cuddling without me." Raising her head a little to look at her sister, the worry she had heard in the girl's voice was written on her face, and Ruby knew it had nothing to do with the cuddling. "Coco and Velvet are two of the toughest huntresses we know. They'll come back and cuddle you into oblivion." "I know," Yang said, her face lightening a little. "Guess it's my fault for going against my rule of not dating people in our line of work, huh? That rule was dumb anyway. We both knew that you wouldn't settle down with someone who couldn't kick your butt." "She's right, Yang," Ruby heard from behind the bench and turned to see Weiss standing there holding cups of steaming drinks from the local Black Cat Cafe. "I've only known you for 6 months, and even I know you need someone who can explore the world with you. Who better than the two best second-year huntresses in Beacon?" "I guess," the blonde replied, lifting Ruby up against her will and scooting them both along the bench so that their white-haired teammate could sit down. Feeling the bench shift a little as Weiss sat down, she lifted her head up and placed it on her partner's lap as she saw the girl pass Yang one of the drinks. Ruby gave the heiress a cheeky grin and received a small roll of the girl's eyes in return, though no move was made to alter the new position. After a few moments of silence, where she simply enjoyed the smell of roses that permeated the air, she felt Yang tap her on her side and looked to see her offering her the drink. Opening her mouth, Yang shook her head and gently tipped a little of the chocolatey contents inside. "Comfy there?" "Very." Ruby grinned at her sister after swallowing the delicious liquid. "Well, don't get used to it," Weiss interjected with a scowl. "So how was training with Blake? Did you get the move down?" "No," she sighed and closed her eyes as a cloud shifted and the low-hanging sun and almost blinded her. "I had other things on my mind and kept messing up." "Really?" Yang asked, the surprise in her voice clear as the sun that was still trying its hardest to force its way through Ruby's eyelids. "You're normally super focused in training." "I had something on my mind, okay? Is that so hard to believe?" "Knowing how you were about training, yeah, it is." "Did you at least work it out?" Weiss' voice asked carefully. "Whatever it was that kept distracting you, I mean." "No," she replied and opened her eyes a little to see Weiss and Yang looking away from each other a little too quickly for her liking. "It's not exactly something I can do anything about." Ruby felt Yang grab onto her legs and hold on tight, while she heard the telltale sound of Weiss making a glyph below her on the bench. "Oh crap. Yang, stop. I don't want to talk about it." "Tough luck, little sister." The blonde chuckled and Ruby felt the laces of one of her boots being untied until it was loose and was quickly pulled off. "Now you either tell me what was stuck on your mind, or I start tickling." "It's not." "That's bullshit with a capital B, and we both know it, so I guess you leave me no choice." "No. Dawn!" Ruby's pleading was cut off as Yang's fingers began to move along the sole of her foot, and she felt a laugh force its way up from her stomach. Trying to squirm away from the torture, she realized that the glyph underneath her was a gravity one to keep her in place, and with no way to escape, she was unable to stop the laughter that erupted from her. The assault continued for what felt like minutes, but finally Yang's fingers stopped. "Ready to talk?" "Weiss, help me." "Nope." Before Ruby could utter another word, Yang's fingers began to move again, and more laughter tore its way out of her. Feeling herself beginning to lose breath, she attempted to pull her legs away again, but even with only one arm, Yang was much too strong. So wanting it to end, she choked out her defeat. Okay. Oh, okay. Me and Blake were reading a comic that she was really excited to read with me, but I ended up falling asleep on her, and I don't know if she was okay with me doing so because she has been really distant ever since. So I thought maybe I said something in my sleep or something that caused her to avoid me, and when she reached for a cookie her hand brushed against my side and a shiver went through my body, and it happened a lot, but I don't know if she was doing it on purpose or if she was just hungry, which is something I can relate to as I love cookies and can't get enough of them, but that was the most cookies I've ever seen her eat, so dash. You're rambling again, Ruby. Yang interrupted her, causing her words to falter as she realized she may have said too much. Unfortunately for her, Weiss let out a loud sigh and cleared her throat. You know you could have just said you like Blake, right? Weiss. Come on, Weiss. I was having fun. Well, I was tired of it, and keeping this glyph up for so long while also listening to word spew is giving me a headache. A pout formed on the brunette's face as Ruby pieced together what the heiress said, and quickly realizing that it was a subtle insult that was directed against the small leader, she crossed her arms, and with a huff. I'm never telling you anything ever again. I wish that was the truth, but it's not, and we both know it. Scowling at her partner, as she felt her back unglue itself from the bench, Ruby sat up and pulled her legs free from her sister's slackened grip, not daring to look at her due to new information that had just been aired. However, as she picked up her boot that had been dropped to the floor and slipped it back on, she heard Yang chuckle lightly to herself as she pulled out her scroll. Ah, Blakey got you feline all smitten, kitten? Yang cooed as she giggled happily to herself, causing Weiss to let out a loud groan and Ruby to blush a deep scarlet. One day you will realize how terrible your puns are, Weiss said, and Ruby could see the snowy-haired girl shaking her head. Says the girl who's been copying them lately. Anyway, I just got a text from Coco that their meeting with Port is done, and Rubes, even if I give you crap about this, understand that I just want you to be happy. So if Blake does that for you, then go for it. But remember, we share a room and my gauntlets are always near my bed. With that, Yang stood and jogged over to the administrative building where her girlfriends were likely going to be exiting soon, leaving Weiss still formulating an appropriate response to the blonde's statement. However, as Yang quickly left earshot, Weiss clearly gave up and admitted to herself that Yang was right in a sense. Have I really been that obvious? The only way you could be more so is if you kissed her, Ruby. Not like that thought hasn't crossed my mind, Ruby admitted and tied her laces, very aware that her face was still beet red. Do you think Blake has noticed too? I don't know. Weiss shrugged and leaned back against the back of the bench. If she hasn't, then she isn't as perceptive as I thought she was. If she has, then she certainly isn't discouraging you. But Blake deserves better than me. Ruby, out of everyone in this school, there is no one better than you for her. I realize that you doubt what you're capable of, but now more than ever, I know for a fact that you are just what Blake needs, even if she doesn't know it herself. How do you know that? She pouted and sat back with her partner after finishing tying her boots. Because you balance each other out in a good way, Weiss explained vaguely and rested a hand comfortingly on Ruby's shoulder. But what happens if she doesn't like me like that? That's just a chance you'll have to take, Ruby. Ruby took the words, letting them roll onto her palate, and stopped pouting as her face took on a thoughtful expression, pondering over her feelings and Blake's responses to being near her, along with how the girl acts around her. Lightly tapping a fist over her open palm, she turned to say thank you to Weiss, only to see that the heiress was already walking away towards a blue-haired boy standing against the wall smiling at her. Chapter 5. Cute, awkward, and infuriating. Slowly threading her way through the familiar red trees of Forever Fall, Blake looked ahead to the rest of her team, though mainly to one member, the pretty leader that was talking to her sister up front. With the amount of fallen leaves on the ground, the girl's cape blended perfectly into the floor and gave the impression that she was simply floating through the forest. In stark contrast, the shining blonde that was laughing next to her stood out like a grim in a teddy bear shop, and Blake watched at the head on blonde hair turn to look at her and wink, her arm moving and the books in her hand quickly blocking of the lower section of their leader's back. Understanding what Yang was implying, she blushed as red as the leaves around her and turned to look away. Can you believe Professor Goodwitch is making us do this again? Weiss said indignantly next to her. We are supposed to be training to be huntresses, not syrup harvesters. Not having any reply worth giving to the heiress, Blake simply gave the girl a shrug and took the spile that the girl held out to her. Stopping against one of the trees, she positioned the spike against the bark and slammed the butt of Gamble's shroud into the flat part to drive it in. Not wanting to waste any of the sap as it meant their mission would take longer, she held a jar underneath and watched as thick magenta liquid flowed freely into it. Ah, someone's grumpy today, Yang teased, her arm sliding around Weiss' shoulders and capturing her in a hug. You know, if you and Neptune are arguing, me, Ko, and Vels have plenty of love left for a fourth. Ugh, Weiss scoffed disapprovingly and shrugged the laughing girl off of her. Me and Neptune are fine. This is just not what we are training for. We are training to be huntresses, Weiss, Ruby said happily and copied Blake's actions on a nearby tree. We might have to protect people who do this for a living, and if we can help while we protect them, then this is good training. Maybe your tone would change if you knew how tough it was to get that stuff out of your hair. Suppressing a smile as one of Yang's hands shot up to her hair and began to check for any traces of sap, she took a chance to capitalize on the blonde being distracted to sneak a glance at her leader. However, a smile broke through onto her face as she caught Ruby dipping her finger into the liquid that poured from the tree and happily sticking it into her mouth, her eyes widening comically as she realized she was being watched, a small grin on her face appearing sheepishly. Unable to do anything but shake her head in amusement at the younger girl, Blake returned to looking at the conversing pair to find that she too was being watched by Weiss. What? She stuttered slightly. Nothing, Weiss replied loftily, and turned to Yang, who was still inspecting her hair. Come on, Yang. Let's go and find other trees, so we can get this over with quicker. With Yang nodding in agreement, they both quickly left to go find more trees, the blonde still fretting over her hair as Weiss tooted her for being silly, as there was no chance that syrup had gotten in her hair yet, but if she kept fretting she might get it there herself. Blake took a few glances at Ruby as she filled some jars with syrup, and randomly took a taste of another jar that she had beside her, eventually, on one of the glances. Blake caught Ruby's eyes looking at her, and blushed before looking away. So, she said cautiously, and shook the spile a little to get the syrup flowing again. How have you been? Since our training session, I mean. Oh, I'm doing better now, the Reaper replied as she sat down beside the filling jar. I think the day out with Yang helped. She smiled, only for it to drop a few seconds later as her eyes widened a little. Sorry, your advice did too. Glad I could help, Blake replied, knowing that it was likely the fact that 3 days ago Yang had, not so politely, told her and Weiss to get lost for a day and dragged her sister off someplace. She had no idea what the sisters spent the day doing, but when they returned, Ruby had been back to her usual smiling, happy self. What about you? Ruby asked cautiously, and Blake noticed the girl begin to fiddle with her laces, something she only did when she was nervous. You seemed pretty annoyed yesterday? Huh? Oh, right. She sighed as the final drops of sap fell from the tap tree, leaving the jar underneath only half full. Just that neon girl that Sun has started dating. She's not really someone I enjoy spending time with, is all. Sneaking another look at the leader, Blake saw confusion write itself across the young girl's face, and feeling a little bad for speaking ill of someone in front of a girl who saw the best in everyone, she quickly explained what she meant. I didn't mean that she's a bad person or anything. She's just a lot to deal with. Oh, that's fair. Ruby smiled, the small little gesture making Blake's stomach flip. I think Yang feels the same about her too. With nothing left to say on the matter, Blake twisted the spile out of the tree and moved over to another to continue her sap farming. As she worked the tap into the thick bark of the new tree, each tap sounded deafening in her ears due to the uncomfortable silence that had stretched between the two of them. Determined to break the silence and maybe actually make something of their time alone together, Blake took a deep breath and tried a new angle of conversation. So, do you remember that chat we had a while back? About people we're interested in? I learned something recently that made mine a lot more likely, she said, her throat feeling a little dry as she had no idea where she was going with the conversation. Oh, what's that? Well, she's into girls, which just so happens to be something that I am as well. Hopefully I can work up the courage to tell her. Looking up after telling Ruby what had been on her mind for a bit, she noticed a slight smile on the girl's lips, and a visibly brighter countenance in her gunmetal silver eyes. The new light not too dissimilar from when she finds a cookie at a bag that she had previously thought empty. Thinking about cookies, she noticed something over the past week. Ruby didn't have any. Do I know her? Ruby's gentle voice broke through her thoughts, and caused her breathing to labor a little. Why you do? Blake stuttered a little as the words tumbled from her mouth. Quite well, actually. Once again, silence filled the space between them, the only sound being that of the slow dripping from Ruby's tap that the girl seemed to have forgotten. However, after what felt like 5 minutes of torture, in which her heart was beating so fast that she wouldn't have been surprised had it burst from her chest, she finally took a deep breath and decided to stop wasting time. Rob? Miss Rose! Glinda's voice interrupted her as the stern woman appeared from behind a tree, clipboard in hand. Where are Miss Schnee and Miss Xiao Long? Turning to face the tree and Glinda walked toward the young leader, Blake tried her best to hide the scarlet blush that had erupted onto her face, and set herself on working the last drops of sap from the tree. Once the jar was fully, she pulled the tap free and took a second to compose herself as Ruby stumbled over every other word she said to the huntress. Heaving a deep sigh as she stepped out of the bathroom fully dressed after a relaxing shower, Ruby plopped down on Weiss's freshly made bed, earning a raised eyebrow from the heiress that was sorting out some paperwork at her desk. Unfortunately, the girl said nothing and continued with what she was doing, so taking a deep breath, Ruby let out another deep sigh, this time earning an annoyed grumble from her best friends, yet the girl still did not speak. In a final attempt, Ruby took one last deep breath and let it out, added a small whine for extra effect. I don't care, Ruby. But wait. But nothing, Weiss said tiredly, and tapped the papers on the table to straighten them. I listened to it all day after we got back from Forever Fall Forest, and again all last night when she was at dinner. That is why I'm having to rush to sort these out before our first class. If you like Blake so much, then just ask her out already. You know she's into girls now. But she already said she likes someone. Ruby pouted and leaning back on the bed, receiving yet another annoyed sigh from Weiss. And she said she only just found out, and I've never really hit it, so I don't think it can be me. Or maybe she just never knew until now, the heiress replied shortly, clipping the document into her folder and putting it into her bag. I doubt it, Ruby sighed, absent-mindedly pulling at a loose bit on string that hung down from the mattress above her. It's probably Reese. She always winks whenever Blake passes by the skating area. Then wait until she goes back to Haven next month, or try and show her why you would be better, Weiss said, and stood up to put her bag over her shoulder. I don't care what you do, just stop pestering me with this. Letting out a small oof as she felt her own bag land on her stomach, Ruby sat up and looked to see Weiss walking out of the door. Bouncing up from the now slightly disheveled bed, she quickly ran after her partner. But I have no one else to talk to about this, Ruby pouted, using her semblance to burst in front of the girl and walking backwards. Yang just teases me when I talk to her. You spent 16 years around her yet still think she is capable of giving good advice? Sometimes, Ruby hummed thoughtfully, keeping up her backwards walk as she followed Weiss to class. But you're my bestie, so please tell me how you confessed to Neptune? Again, Weiss threw her a tired look and Ruby pushed the door of the dormitory open, the crisp air hitting the back of her neck and causing her to shiver a little. Giving her shoulders a shrug to shift her cloak higher, she turned around and walked beside her partner. I did not confess anything, Weiss replied, holding her head up high, as if such a thing was beyond her. I told him to meet for lunch, and he did. What? Ruby cried, and let her arms drop to her side. I can't do that. Then I don't know how to help you. Weiss shrugged and picked up her pace towards one of the side buildings that was dedicated to general studies subjects such as maths and science. You ugh! As she let out a small groan, the feeling of hopelessness began to overtake her again. It had been nearly a week since she had decided to try and ask Blake out, but every attempt that she made ended in her wanting to gently bang her head on the wall in hopes that the small, repeated impacts would remove the embarrassment from her memory. The most progress that had been made was their small conversation during the field trip, unfortunately that had been cut short by Glinda. Fortunately, the General Studies building was not too far from the dormitory, so it took less than 5 minutes to reach it and start walking down the hallway that led to their class. Pushing the door open, she allowed Weiss to walk in first, a decision she immediately regret. Being the last two to arrive, there were only 2 chairs left for them to sit in, one being a seat next to the walkway, and the other being next to Blake. Without a second of hesitation, Weiss sat down in the chair next to the walkway, leaving the chair next to Blake as the only one Ruby could sit in. Not sure what to do as her nerves instantly set on fire, Ruby simply stood there like a lost lamb, trying to think of a good reason not to take her seat. "Miss Rose," she heard Professor Peach say from behind her, the voice causing her to jump a little and spin to face the stern-looking woman. "You are holding up my class. Take your seat." "Why, yes, ma'am," she stuttered, the fear of being in trouble suppressing her nerves enough to make herself scurry over to her teammate and take her seat. Trying her best not to look at the raven-haired fauness beside her, due to knowing that her face was likely bright red, Ruby quickly busied herself pulling out her books and getting ready for what would likely be the next couple of hours of boring note-taking. However, as she scrambled through her bag, pulling books aside, she was unable to find her pencil case. After a couple of seconds of searching, she let out a small sigh, resigning to having to borrow one from Professor Peach and face the consequences of holding up the class again. But just as she began to raise her hand, she felt a small tap on her right shoulder and turned to see Blake holding out a pen for her. "You okay?" the beautiful girl asked, a small hint of worry in the glowing amber eyes. "You look a little flushed today." "I'm fine," Ruby stuttered again, reaching out to take the pen. "Thank why." "Talking, Miss Rose," Professor Peach barked, causing both of them to jump slightly and turn to face the teacher. "Hold up my class again, and you will find your lunch break to be shorter than usual. You too, Miss Belladonna." "Sorry, ma'am," they both chorused in return. With a stern look at them both, Peach turned back to address the class and Ruby settled in to take notes, the fact that Blake had been watching her close enough to notice she had been flushed making a faint smile pull at her lips. It had been a few days since Weiss had pulled Yang away from the other two during the mission in Forever Fall, where they had both hid behind nearby trees to listen in on the conversation between their other two teammates. She had learned from Yang a couple of days prior that Blake had taken an interest in the young leader, and since she had learned the fact, she noticed all the little clues that had up till that point had escaped her view. The way Blake would sneak glances, the way her touch would linger on Ruby for just a little longer than normal. It had been cute at first, watching the two girls dance around and work up the courage to say more than 2 words to each other. However, that was almost a week ago, and after a week, the charm had worn off and annoyance had begun to settle in. So sat in the library with Yang studying yet another book of notes from yet another boastful lecture, Weiss saw an opportunity to talk about the situation without the two overhearing anything. The white-haired girl spoke up. "Are you as tired of them as I am yet?" Originally, both Ruby and Blake was supposed to have been studying with them, but after what seemed to be the faun's 20th failed attempt to confess to the brunette, Blake had decided to sulk off somewhere, and Ruby was busy doing whatever it was she did instead of sulking. Weiss' guess was stuffing her face with ungodly amount of baked goods. "Yup," the blonde beside her replied, finally dropping the book she had been feigning interest in since they had sat down. "I swear, at this point I doubt I would even be mad if I walked in on them half naked. I'd just be bloody glad they finally did something other than freak out constantly. You think we should do something about it?" "What can we do? Other than shove them together in a closet until they confess to one another?" "You said it, not me." Yang chuckled mischievously and placed her feet on the table. "But that's not a bad idea, honestly. Or we send Rubes to go find the sulking kitty cat on the roof. Speaking of the sugar devil, where is she? I don't want to wander into the kitchen to find a bloated Ruby that ate way too many cookies and can't fit through the door." "Well, if you don't want to find her like that, we better go stop her from making more cookies." Yang grinned with a little sigh. "Follow me. I have a good idea of where she is." Giving Yang a suspicious look as the blonde stood up, Weiss took a second to think as to whether it really was their place to intervene. However, as she thought, she also remembered the fact that Ruby had almost bent one of the guards of her precious Mertensader during a nervous bumbling session, and quickly stood up to join the blonde in her plan. Chapter 6, Intervention. Ruby thought to herself as she slowly made her way to the roof, her feet dragging as she walked due to the fact she had already made enough of a fool of herself for one day. If Yang knew where she was, why didn't she get her? After trying again to say something to Blake that wasn't stupid, mindless babble, and completely failing, she had been enjoying drowning her sorrow in a large glass milk and quite a large pack of cookies she had found in the bag attached to her bed. How those cookies got there she had no idea, since she was out of money, and Yang refused to buy her any more. She had been just over halfway through the pack when Yang and Weiss had burst into the room and demanded she go and get Blake from the roof, because Glinda wanted to meet with them all. When she had asked why Yang hadn't gone and retrieved their fourth teammate herself, her sister had simply stolen the pack of cookies and said she wasn't getting them back until after the meeting. So clearly having no other choice, she had given in and agreed. As she trudged up the stairs to the roof, Ruby couldn't help but feel anxious over talking to the black-haired girl. The last time they had talked that morning, Blake had been trying to tell her something, and while the girl spoke, all Ruby could think about was just blurting it out and getting the rejection over with. But just as she tried to speak up, her feet had somehow become tangled, sending her spilling to the floor and almost skewering herself on Weiss' rapier. Before she had even picked herself up, Weiss had come storming out of the bathroom and began to shout at her for being so careless. By the time the heiress had calmed down, Blake had already left the room, and all she had succeeded in doing was making a fool of herself. So it didn't surprise her that she found her hand stopping as it reached out to pull open the door that led to the roof. She knew that the only thing she was there to do was inform her teammate that they had a meeting with their teacher, but she was nervous nonetheless. So looking at her fingers shake slightly, she took a couple of deep breaths to steel herself. However, they didn't seem to work, and she almost let out a scream as she felt a hand rest on her shoulder. Turning around to see who had followed her, she saw her sister wearing a grin that sent a shiver down her spine. Just behind her, resting against the wall, was her own partner with the rapier that had almost been in her chest that morning. "Do you remember when I taught you to swim?" the blonde asked, the question catching her off guard as she tried to remember why that smile was so familiar. "Yeah, you threw me into the deep end." "Exactly." Yang nodded with her malicious smile, her other arm reaching out to rip open the door. Realizing exactly what her sister was about to do, heat and panic immediately rose within her as her face paled. "Wah! Good luck, Rubbles." Before she could even attempt to fight, the door was pulled open, and she felt herself being pushed with enough force to send her flying onto the roof. Activating her aura as she fell and slid along the ground a little, she quickly turned around to see her sister give her a wink and push the door closed. Picking herself up and running up the door, her hand closed around the handle, and instantly felt like it had been plunged into a bucket of ice water. "No, and you," she said frantically, and tried to push it with her shoulder, her mind already knowing it was fruitless as Weiss' ice was harder than diamond. While trying her hardest to get the door open, she heard her scroll ping as well as one from behind her, and pulling it out desperately, she read the message as she heard it aloud from the girl behind her. "If you want to get off the roof before dinner, talk." Turning around a little too fast, Ruby slipped and fell back against rapidly cooling metal door and watched as the older girl let out a sigh before shaking her head slightly, her own face turning a little red. Struggling to right herself, while hiding the blush she knew was visible on her own cheeks, she quickly realized that the redness of Blake's face had nothing to do with the slightly cold air that blew through the night. "Tea-talk? Tea-talk about WH what?" Ruby squeaked, hearing her scroll ping again a couple of seconds later. "Something that both of you have been trying and failing to do for the last week and a half, but keep being interrupted. See cute at first, but it became infuriating. Myself and Yang decided to take extreme measures. There is no meeting with Glinda. Now either talk or next time we lock you in a closet." Blushing a deeper scarlet the more Blake read, Ruby tried her best to look anywhere but at the girl. As such, she was extremely surprised when the sound of footsteps on gravel slowly made their way towards her. Finding a small amount of courage to look up, though still avoiding the girl's eyes, she saw Blake's arm reach behind her and pull her weapon from her back. Intrigued by what Blake could be doing, she watched as the faunus slipped what she instantly recognized as a blank bullet into the top of her gun's magazine and switched her sword to its gun form, pressing the barrel against the metal door. "We're not going to talk." While the words were said near her, Ruby could tell immediately that they weren't for her, and sure enough, another ping issued from their scrolls. The second it did, Blake pulled the trigger, and a loud bang issued from the gun, followed by a much louder scream from the other side of the door. Despite her nerves and how uncomfortable she was, Ruby felt a smile pull at her lips as her sister's loud swearing caught her ears, as well as the pattering of feet downstairs. "That should take care of them," Blake sighed, her head looking down so that their eyes met for a brief moment. Before anything else could be said, however, Blake pushed herself away from the door and turned to walk towards the edge of the roof, where Ruby saw her book sat on the ledge. Watching the girl sit down, Ruby tried to think of what to do when the girl's hand came out and gave the open space next to her a quick pat, the intention behind it very clear. Though she was still extremely hesitant, Ruby knew there was nothing else she could do. If she didn't go over, then she wouldn't get off of the roof for hours and might even accidentally insult Blake by giving off the impression of not wanting to sit with her. So step by step, she slowly worked her way over to the knee-high wall that the gorgeous girl was seated on. Taking a deep breath as she stopped so close to her teammate that she could smell the girl's floral perfume on the wind, Ruby fiddled with the hem of her sleeve and slowly sat herself on the stone wall and turned to face the magnificent view it gave of Beacon CCT Tower in the distance. Not wanting to be the first to speak as she was likely to make a fool of herself, Ruby simply sat quietly and waited for the raven-haired beauty to break the silence. "Your sister's a real pain sometimes," the fauness finally said after 5 minutes, her tone light and cautious. "Tell me about it," she replied, so quietly that she was worried the gentle wind might have drowned her out. "So, what were you doing up here?" "Reading," Blake replied, her hand moving to hover over the book that rested beside her. "It's also a great place to think." "Oh, about what?" The girl didn't reply immediately. Instead, she pulled her a leg up and resting an arm on it, her eyes deep in thought. Another little minute passed in complete silence, until finally, Blake gave out a loud sigh. "Ruby, can I ask you something?" "As sure," Ruby replied, a little nervous of the question that was going to come her way. However, though many ideas of what it could be rushed through her head, none of them even came close to what the girl actually asked. "Do you think I'm a monster?" Taken aback by the question and the self-doubting way in which Blake had said it, Ruby had immediately turned to face the girl and saw her staring pointedly down at her lap. "What? How could I ever think that?" she replied quickly, her nerves instantly forgotten in her need to assure the girl. "Because of everything I did," the girl said quietly, her amber eyes losing their shine as the sun moved behind some clouds. "Ruby, my time in the White Fan wasn't peaceful. I never killed anyone, but I've hurt people. I've been the reason that Grimm have attacked villages. And despite everything I've told myself over the last year since I left, I did it willingly because I thought it was helping us be respected." "Oh," Ruby replied slowly, trying her best to be just as supportive as Blake had when she had during their training session. "But you're not that person anymore." "That doesn't change that I was," Blake countered quickly and rested her forehead on the back of her hand so that her face was hidden from view. "Or what I've done. You saw how Weiss used to treat the fauness because of the White Fan, and she isn't even the worst, but I contributed to that. In my attempts to earn my rave more respect, I just gave people more reason to hate us." Feeling for the fauness, and not wanting to make her even sadder than she already was, Ruby took a moment to think on how to respond as she watched the green orbs of Beacon Tower steadily rise and fall in the distance. Finally thinking she at least had a grip on what to say, she slowly tried to cheer up the fauness. "Blake, I don't think you're a monster," she said kindly and fiddled with her sleeve again. "In fact, you're actually the kind of person who inspired me to become a huntress. I told you once that Yang used to read fairy tales to me. Well, there were a few where the hero wasn't even a hero at the start. There was one story Yang used to read to me a lot about a prince who was cursed to be a beast because he was cold and selfish, and after he was cursed, he cut everyone away from him and isolated himself in his castle. He would act cruel to those who came to it. He even imprisoned a man there, and once his daughter came to save him, the beast only let him go because she promised to stay instead, and he needed a girl to fall in love with him for the curse to break. But the longer she stayed, the more he found himself changing. He no longer wanted to do all the bad things he had before. He didn't want her to love his tricks or his lies. He found himself wanting to be someone she could genuinely love instead. And eventually she did, and the curse was broken. There were so many stories that Yang told me, and a lot of them had the same thing. The heroes were the heroes, and the villains were the villains." Ruby smiled to herself as she fondly remembered those nights Yang would read to her. "But it was that story that taught me that isn't always the case. Sometimes people are just lost, but they can change, and as stupid as it probably sounds, you have always been like that prince to me. Someone who was lost, who hurt people, but you eventually realized that was wrong and decided to spend your life helping people. That's the choice that I think matters." Falling silent as she finished her speech, Ruby looked to her side to see if she had made a fool of herself yet again, and caught Blake looking directly at her, though thankfully the sadness that had been in her eyes from before was much less. Feeling herself heat up a little in embarrassment of saying something so personal to the girl, she quickly looked away. "So I remind you of a beast?" she heard Blake say quietly, though her tone was very hard to make out over the blood pumping loudly in Ruby's ears. Almost instantly, Ruby's eyes flew open as she realized how bad of an analogy she had made, and out of fear of having insulted the girl, she turned back to her and tried to make things right. "No, I didn't. That's not what I meant," she blustered and waved her arms in front of her in panic. "I mean, you do have kitty ears, but they're really cute and not beastly at all, and Yang acts more like a beast than you in." "Ruby? WH what?" she squeaked, worried that Blake was about to get up and leave due to a misunderstanding. "I was joking." "Oh." Pausing as a small smile pulled at Blake's lips, and the girl gave her head a short shake, Ruby suddenly realized she had just called the girl she was crushing on cute, and knew from the heat rising in her body that her face was likely redder than her cape. Thankfully, she heard the fawness chuckle slightly at her side. "Sorry," Blake said happily when she stopped her chuckling. "You're pretty cute when you're flustered, so I couldn't help myself." "What?" Ruby screamed in her head after Blake's admission. "What the?" Did she? "Why you think I'm so cute?" she asked before she could stop herself. Looking to her side, she noticed a redness to Blake's cheeks that definitely were not there before, and felt her heart begin to beat even faster. "Why yes," the girl replied with a slight nod after a couple of seconds. "When you're flustered, you are really honest. It's one of the many things I like about you." Not knowing how to respond to that, she looked down at her legs in embarrassment and thought of anything she could say that wouldn't be weird. However, before she could think of anything, she heard Blake take a deep breath next to her. "Ruby?" The voice came out strong but faltered towards the end, and it was that slight faltering that made her stomach spin and caused her to return her gaze to the fawness beside her. "Why yes. I don't want to make things awkward, or have you be uncomfortable if you don't feel the same, but I—" Watching with held breath as Blake paused to take a deep breath, she saw the girl's face turn slightly, so that their eyes met, causing her heart to flutter from the sincerity behind them. "I really like you, and I don't know if you feel the same. You probably don't, but if you do, I was wondering if you would like to go out sometime? Just the two of us?" Minutes must have passed in silence as all kinds of thoughts exploded in her mind, thoughts telling her to reply immediately, some telling her to cry out in happiness, even some telling her to run. But as they all settled down, she knew there was only one reply she needed to give in that moment. "I would like that," she breathed quietly, hoping to that Blake had heard her, because she doubted she would be able to say it again. Thankfully, she heard Blake let out a relieved sigh, and felt some of the anxiety over what had just occurred pass as she watched the fawness put down her book and slide off the wall and onto the roof itself, coming to a stop to sit on the floor with her back against it. Confused by the girl's actions, Ruby didn't realize that Blake patted the ground beside her until she did so a second time. Ruby then got up from her seat and joined her. Sitting on the floor next to the girl that she was technically dating at that point, Ruby found that the silence was no longer uncomfortable as the others had been. Sure, it was still a little awkward, but for the most part, it was far more relaxing than the others had been. So feeling peaceful atmosphere helped her courage work itself up, she carefully shuffled a little closer to the raven-haired beauty that sat beside her. Leaning back against the cold wall at the bottom of the stairs, Yang stretched her arms out before her until her elbows popped pleasantly, and let out a deep sigh. She and Weiss had been sitting there for almost 30 minutes waiting on her sister and her partner to finally get their feelings out in the open, and while she hated having to force them to admit it, she knew neither of them would have talked about it otherwise, even if her ear was still ringing from her partner's dirty trick. "So?" Weiss sighed as she typed away on her scroll. "You think they had said it yet?" "No idea," Yang replied honestly. Knowing her partner and her sister, they could be sitting there for hours. "Are you messaging them?" "No, just Neptune to tell him that I might not make it to dinner." "Ah." Yang grinned, looking at the position Weiss was sat in, which her arms were resting between her knees, her scroll held just beyond the hem of her skirt. "You know, if you're sending him a pic to make up for it, you may want to move your frills. They're kinda in the way." A red blush appeared on the heiress's pale cheeks, and she instantly pushed the hem of her skirt down to block anything that may have been in sight, and gave her a scowl. I am not! And why are you looking down there? Hey, you chose the third step, kinda in my line of sight here. She chuckled as Weiss fixed herself and gave her an indignant look. So I've never actually asked, but what exactly are you and Neptune? Like, I know you're dating, but why him? He doesn't really seem like your type. I am many things, Yang. Weiss sighed after a couple of seconds as she put her scroll away. I am a huntress in training, the heiress to the Schnee Dust Company, a celebrated singer, and when I leave Beacon, I will be inundated with all of that. I will be leading my grandfather's company and trying to fix the mess my father has made of it. I will be taking on missions to help whoever I can, and I will even be singing when I feel the urge to. So right now, Beacon is my only chance to, as you would say, kick back and have fun. That's what Neptune is, he's fun. I'm under no disillusion that we are serious, and neither is he, but right now, he is what I want because I know I won't get to have this chance again for a very long time once I am done here. I can't say I haven't had those relationships. Yang after a moment, smiling at the idea that Weiss was actually just doing something, or someone, for the fun of it. Kinda glad they're behind me though. You think you, Coco, and Velvet are forever? Though the tone Weiss had said it was skeptical, Yang knew it was only because of the girl's outlook on things. I dunno. She shrugged, deciding to be honest since Weiss had been honest with her. I hope so, but things can always happen, I guess. At the minute though, I love being part of something more serious. Well, I'm happy for you, Weiss said with a smile, and Yang could tell that the girl was being genuine. Have you heard from them since they left? Giving Weiss a small nod, a smitten grin pulled at her lips as she reached into her pocket and pulled out her scroll, quickly bringing up the picture they had sent her at 3 in the morning. As she found it, she let herself take a moment to gaze at Coco hugging Velvet, and the caption below that read missing our Dragon 3, before turning her scroll to show Weiss. The group they're escorting passed by a relay tower before settling down. She smiled as Weiss looked at the picture and rolled her eyes. They should be back sometime next week. I'm guessing you won't be staying in our dorm the night they do then, she said with a chuckle and leaned back against the step. You would be right. Cut off by the shaking of the device in her hand, she quickly pulled it back and opened up the message from Blake. We've talked, now open the door. They said they've talked, Yang relayed to Weiss, and earned a disbelieving eyebrow raise in return. Should I ask for proof? Receiving a nod from the snowy-haired heiress, Yang quickly typed out the message and waited for the reply. As nothing came back after almost a minute, she turned back to her friend to continue the conversation. However, just as she did, another message came in. Finally! She cheered victoriously, and turned the scroll around so that Weiss could see the close-up picture of Blake's hand resting on top of Ruby's. About fucking time! Well, Weiss sighed as she stood up and pulled her rapier towards her. Guess I should go and melt the ice. Are you coming? You really think I'm gonna miss the looks on their faces when we open that door? Yang laughed, standing up and following the girl up the stairs. Reaching the top of the stairs, she watched as Weiss reached down and touched the tip of her rapier against the tough sheet of ice the girl had created over the door's handle and lock. Pressing the trigger, thin red lines worked their way towards the tip of the blade, and the ice slowly began to melt. Getting impatient as it was taking a little too long for her liking, Yang waited until the ice was thin enough and activated her aura as she punched the remaining block, the ice shattering and scattering to the ground. Real elegant, Yang, Weiss said with her iconic scowl. Real effective too. She grinned back and reached out to pull the door open. The moment it was open, both of their eyes fell upon their other two teammates, both of them standing a small distance apart and pointedly not looking at each other. From the red blush that tinted both their cheeks, Yang knew that they had definitely discussed what they needed to, and feeling the typical sister urge well within her, she leaned against the wall and flashed them a cocky smile. Sup, lovebirds? Chapter 7, Payback, Contentment, and Self-Doubt. Not much had been said about their conversation on roof in the week since it had happened, and while a lot of the awkwardness that permeated every interaction between her and Blake had faded, Ruby still often found herself nervous around the girl. Though she certainly no longer stumbled over herself whenever Blake was in the room, she did find that catching the amber eyes of her teammates still made her blush furiously at the remembrance that they did indeed have an upcoming date at some point in the future. Unfortunately, they had yet to organize a day they could go out, as their classes, which ran from 7 in the morning to 5 in the afternoon, kept them rather busy. To add to her embarrassment, Yang had taken to teasing her at every given opportunity. Whenever she entered their room, sly comments would be made as the blonde laid on her bed grinned down at them both, and while she would normally tell her to shut up, Ruby knew her sister was only trying her best to distract herself. It was mostly because of that, however, that she was dreading what would meet her as she walked to her dorm, though partly due to an unfortunate incident that had happened at lunch. As she returned to the table with her plate of food, the usual cheese and ham sandwich with some cookies, and gone to sit down next to Blake as she had done for the past few days, Weiss had activated a white glyph that pushed the fauna sideways. Unable to stop her descent in time, Ruby had quickly found herself sitting on her teammate's lap, causing her to turn bright red and leap up. Thankfully, her reactions were good enough to make sure she didn't drop her food, but Yang and Weiss had both burst into a fit of giggles as Blake blushed from the incident too. Shaking her head of the still fresh memory, Ruby let out a sigh and continued towards her room, that is finally in sight, and pushed the door open. The same sight greeted her as it always did. Blake was sat on her bed reading a lengthy novel, looking as beautiful as ever, while Yang was sat at a desk next to the door, a bored look on her face, as she studied what she instantly recognized to be one of her own books on mechanics. "Hey, sis," Yang said as Ruby entered the room, picking up her pen and quickly shifting through her papers that were filled with messy handwriting. "What's the name of the part of your side that moves everything?" "The actuator?" "That's the one," she replied and quickly wrote it down. "Your book was useless, by the way." "What?" Ruby said indignantly, pulling the book towards her and shaking her head. "There's an entire half a chapter dedicated to them in here." "No, there isn't." Yang scowled and pulled the book back. "I swear I looked." "Chapter 25 motion," Blake said in a happy voice while not looking up from her book. Watching her sister throw Blake a dirty look as she flipped through the pages, Ruby moved to the bathroom and glanced inside to see if her partner was there. Seeing nothing, she moved back into the main room and placed Crescent Rose on the spare desk before starting to take her boots off. "What the he?" Yang hopped and threw the book back down on the table. The page turned to the exact thing Blake had said. "Why didn't you say something, Blake? I've been doing this for over an hour now." "Payback." Though the single word was said matter-of-factly with a small shrug, from her position Ruby could see that the girl was giving her a smile from behind the book, and feeling a slight warmth crawl up her cheeks, she gave one back in return. However, once her boots were off, and she went to sit down, she had a sudden urge to sit somewhere else, and knowing Yang was eventually going to tease them regardless, she took a small breath and gave in to the urge. "So where's Weiss?" she asked, trying her best to sound calm and collected as she sat down on Blake's bed despite feeling her heart pick up its pace a little. "She said something about training with Pira," Yang replied, her eyes narrow at them slightly. "She should be back soon though." "Fair enough," Ruby said, sitting back against the wall, but making sure to keep a respectable distance from her teammate. "Well, I'm robbing you of your headphones so I can focus, Rubes." Yang sighed and leaned over to pull them from the bag Ruby had left them in before turning back to them with a half-stern glare. "But I am still in the room, so no frickety-frack in that sack." "Yawn!" Blushing as Yang chuckled to herself while linking her scroll and slipped the headphones on, the bright red standing out oddly against the head of blonde, Ruby let out a frustrated sigh and crossed her legs. With Yang finally no longer looking at them, she shuffled a little closer to Blake, and the girl moved her book down so she could see it. Reading a little of the girl's current page, she saw that it was a rather dry book for her tastes, as it revolved around a mafia in a fictional city called New York. However, the feel of simply sitting next to the girl was causing heat to flush her cheeks, but wanting to finally push through the awkwardness, she took a deep breath and tried to focus on reading. "So how was class?" Blake said quietly, one side of the girl's cat ears flicking towards Yang, and Ruby knew the girl was listening for the music. "Not bad," she replied honestly. Shortly after being announced as the team leader, Ojpin had told her that she could take up some extra classes to catch up with everyone else if she wanted, and while at first she had been reluctant, after a falling out with Weiss, she had decided they would probably be for the best. "Glinda says I shouldn't need them anymore after this semester." "That's great," Blake hummed, and even Ruby could tell there was more the girl wanted to say. "So, you're going to have some more free time?" "I guess," Ruby stuttered back, and kept her eyes glued onto the book despite no longer taking in a word. Feeling a little tension rise between them, Ruby remained quiet as she could tell Blake had more to ask. I don't suppose you have some of that free time this Saturday, do you? Finally looking up from the book, Ruby saw Blake biting her lip a little. If you do, then maybe we could finally go on that date? Despite knowing it would eventually come, and even having waited for them to arrange an actual date for almost a week, Ruby still found herself caught off guard at the question. Saturday was only 2 days away, and it wasn't that she didn't want to say yes, as she certainly did, but she had never actually been on a date before. While the talk of the roof had floated the idea by her, it didn't have a date, so it didn't hit her as much as it just had. Apparently, however, Blake took her silence to mean something she hadn't intended. If you've changed your mind or do. And no! Ruby interrupted quickly and span around to face the girl, noticing the slight look of uncertainty in her eyes. It's not that. Feeling heat rise up within her for fear that she had caused Blake to doubt herself, Ruby shook her head and tried her best to show there had been a mistake the best she could, by gently tapping the tips of her 2 index fingers together. I've never been on that before. As it usually did when she was feeling extremely self-conscious, her words came out in one string of incoherent babble, and she wasn't surprised to receive a raised eyebrow in return. I've never been on a date before, Ruby interrupted, albeit still speaking quietly and very fast. Taking a deep breath and looking down at her lap, Ruby waited for Blake to reply. However, the one she received only confused her. Honestly, neither have I, the fauness replied in a soft voice, and Ruby saw the book being placed aside. Not really anyway. But you're so BA. In her disbelief of the girl's admission, Ruby had accidentally spoken aloud instead of in her head, and though she had quickly caught herself, she knew Blake could make out what she had said, and was suddenly gripped by the desire to completely wrap herself in her cloak and not come back out until she was sure Blake had forgotten she even existed. Thanks, she heard Blake chuckle nervously. But I sort of just fell into my last relationship. Despite the embarrassment that still lingered, Ruby felt a little bit of curiosity well within her at those words. However, knowing Blake was notoriously secretive about her past, she decided not to question her. Instead, she looked up and gave the girl a small smile. I guess this will be both our first dates then. It doesn't have to be this Saturday, Blake said slowly, and Ruby could tell she was trying to not put pressure on her. We can wait until you're comfortable. And no. Ruby shook her head, not wanting to chicken out, as she knew that if she did then, it would just drag her embarrassment out longer. This Saturday is fine. You're sure? Blake asked again, and Ruby gave her a quick nod. Okay Both of them were cut off as the door slammed open, making all of them jump as a sweaty and rather annoyed-looking wife stormed into the room, her t-shirt slightly torn and muddy up one side. Muttering to herself something about stupid magnets, she quickly rifled through her drawers to pull out some fresh clothes and a towel and disappeared into the bathroom, the door slamming just as loudly behind her as the other had. Looks like Pira had fun. Yang grinned at the bathroom, having pulled the headphones off due to the sudden intrusion. However, her eyes quickly turned to them and squinted suspiciously at the fact they were sitting rather close and facing each other. Hey, thought I said no frickety frack. First, Blake sighed and turned to her partner. I have no idea what that means, but I'm pretty sure we were not doing it. Second, we were just talking. Yeah, Yang, Ruby replied and stuck out her tongue at her sister. But out? Fine, I'll believe you for now. Slipping the headphones back over her ears and turning back to her work. But I'm watching you both. What does frickety frack mean? Blake asked a couple of seconds after Yang had returned to her work. And nothing, Ruby replied, very aware that her cheeks were likely very red as she grabbed the book that had been discarded on the bed and opened it back up to the page they had left off it. Now let's just return to the book. Watching the faunous beautiful eyes slowly work it out, Ruby pulled the book up to cover her face, as she knew it really wasn't that hard to decipher Yang's meaning. Thankfully, whether Blake figured it out or not she didn't know, as the girl silently joined her side and gave her a smile as she reached out and took the book. Much to her annoyance, however, as Ruby looked at the girl's lips, certain images came to her mind. Stupid Yang, she thought to herself as she settled in to read the book, hoping the images would pass in time. Blake stared into the mirror as she fiddled with the bow in her hand, trying her best to convince herself she didn't need it. She hated what it meant, hated that it made her ears itch, hated that people often referred to it as cute, but the thing she hated the most was that it hid who she was. She had originally begun to wear it during her later years in the White Fang, as it had helped avoid the looks whenever she was transferred to a new camp, due to the fact that many there looked at her ears as a belladonna mark and attributed them with a leader who they believed abandoned them, and even she had believed it too. For years she had hated her parents, thinking them too weak to do what was necessary, too cowardly to stand up and fight. So in her attempt to leave them behind, she had pulled a ribbon from the hands of a traveling merchant that had refused her service and hid her ears from the world. However, since leaving the White Fang, while it certainly still helped avoid unwanted attention, it was more to remind her of what she did, so that every time she looked in the mirror, she could judge herself. But she didn't want to judge herself, especially not when the night ahead made her happier than she had any right being. Saturday had finally arrived, and with their classes having finished at 1, it was almost time for her date with Ruby after 4 hours of worry. In less than an hour, she would be meeting the young Reaper, whom she had not seen since their classes had ended, due to the Reaper deciding to get changed in Team CFEY's room. They had agreed to meet each other near the gate that lead out of the school's premises, and from there, they would be headed to a small food court that was located along the road that led into Beacon from Vale. While the food court was not exactly approved by the school, a number of students tended to flock to it anyway, as Beacon's cafeteria food had a tendency to be rather bland. At that thought, she remembered that no one at Beacon knew that she was a fauness and let out a deep sigh. Due to her bow, she had managed to avoid Cardin and many others like him, and was not too keen on dealing with them. So feeling her resolve crumble and preparing for the stab of guilt that always came, she looked into the mirror and slowly affixed the fabric over her ears. However, just as she was finishing the knot, she heard the door click open behind her, and a light sigh of exasperation. Turning to face the door, expecting to see Yang, she was surprised to instead see Weiss standing there shaking her head slightly. "Still wearing that stupid thing, I see," the heiress said bluntly with a scowl painted on her face, as she placed her bag onto the desk. "I had hoped today might finally make you see how dumb it is. It helps avoid unnecessary attention." Blake sighed back at the girl and finished the knot before giving herself one last check over, purposely keeping her eyes away from the reflection of her head. "If you say so," the girl said dismissively, the tone of her voice making it clear that the shrugging of her shoulders was more in reply to her answer than to remove her jacket. "So where are you two going?" "Ruby refused to tell me." "Because she knows that you will tell Jan and both of you would spy on us." "Please, I have better things to do with my time than watching my partner blunder her way through a night with the only person who can apparently look past her idiocy." Though she raised an eyebrow in response to the insult, just like Weiss' words, it was more for show. She knew for a fact that the two girls were much closer than anyone could guess, and that while Weiss still had a tendency to be less than hospitable, she really did care for her partner. "Well, I am still not telling you," Blake said stubbornly, not trusting the girl's words for a second. "Where is Yang anyway?" "With Ruby, though she was paying more attention to Coco's pillow than her sister when I left." Not surprising, Blake thought to herself, recalling a foggy memory from that morning during which she had been woken up early by Yang talking on the phone to her girlfriends. She knew their check-in had originally supposed to have been days ago, but no word had been heard from them, so she could hardly be angry at being woken after hearing the relief in her partner's voice. "Well, at least they finally checked in," she sighed, and turned around to finally face the heiress. "So what are you doing tonight anyway?" "Studying." The tone was less than convincing, and caused Blake to scowl suspiciously at the girl. "Port's class? Or Oobleck?" Blake asked with a straight face, as she knew the girl had studied for all but one class for the last week. "Peaches," Weiss answered, her voice a little smoother than before as she clearly caught on to Blake's ploy. "Would you mind if I borrow your notes tomorrow then? You know I'm struggling for that class." Knowing that Weiss had no way out of that one, she suppressed a victorious smile as Weiss turned to face her with a defeated look. As strict as the girl was, she never refused to share her work, as she considered a bad score for one of the team also reflected badly on her. "Fine." She sighed in frustration and crossed her arms. "If you must know, with you and Ruby gone, and Yang staying in CFEY's room for the night, I'm having Neptune over. It's not like I am going to have the room to myself like this again for some time." Though the small heiress was stood resolutely with her arms crossed, Blake could clearly see the red tint on her snow-white skin, for as regal and dignified as the girl acted in public, So much so that Blake often forgot that they were the same age. Weiss still had those moments where the normal, teenage girl she actually was shone through. While she wasn't exactly sure of what Weiss and Neptune's relationship was, as she frequently saw the blue-haired boy flirt with other girls while hanging out with Sun, she knew that Weiss could be rather testy when people tried to dig too far into what the two of them got up to in private. So deciding that it would be best not to press the point, as the last time she remembered Yang doing that Weiss had pressed the point of her rapier to the girl's chest, Blake simply rolled her eyes at the girl and moved to sit on her bed so she could put her shoes on. Well then, Blake sighed and slipped her shoes on. I will try not to screw up so that we can stay out longer. As if you could screw this up, Weiss scoffed, searching through her drawers for a second before pulling out a towel. Ruby hasn't shut up about you for the past month. Blake this and Blake that. I'm just glad you felt the same because I think I would rather go back to Atlas than deal with that again. You don't mean that, Blake said, looking down at her shoe to hide the blush she feared was on her cheeks. I suppose not entirely at least, Weiss admitted with a sigh. But trust me when I say you cannot screw this up. Thanks. Because Blake was still busy tying her laces, she didn't hear the heiress approach until it was too late, and by the time she did, there was already a small tugging feeling on top of her head. Before she could react, she felt the ribbon slide along her ears as Weiss pulled it away, and out of reach for the grab Blake quickly threw out to reclaim it. Though she would much prefer you to not be wearing this, she said, holding the fabric beyond Blake's reach. Despite knowing Weiss was right, she still stood up and snatched the ribbon from the girl. Quickly tying it back in place, Blake saw Weiss roll her eyes and walk away to sit on her bed. You know I can't, she said quietly and sat back down to put her other shoe on. Why? Weiss' voice made it clear the question was less her asking for an answer and more her demanding one. As usual, she considered lying, just as she had when Weiss had first entered the room, but since she girl had been honest with her about her plans even though it embarrassed her, she decided that she should at least be honest for once too. Taking a deep breath, she shook her head and looked up at the snowy-haired girl. I'm not ready yet. You never will be until you take that first step, Weiss countered immediately. You know that as well as I do. She knew that was true. While Weiss was just as secretive about her family as Blake was about her past, she had learned enough over the months to know that Weiss' life was far from what she first assumed it was, and that to even get to Beacon, she had to make a sacrifice. Most obvious of which being the scar that stood out prominently over the girl's left eye. I know Weiss. Blake sighed and stood up, now fully dressed. Checking the clock on the windowsill, she saw there were only 15 minutes until she had to meet Ruby, so she quickly grabbed her wallet from under her pillow and shoved it into her back pocket before turning back to the heiress, who was already sitting on her bed. And I will take that step one day, just not today. Your choice. The girl shrugged, her attention turning to the cabinet, and ran a hand through her hair as she flicked her finger through one of the many old vinyls the team owned. But the longer you wait, the harder it will be. Inaction breeds doubt. Action breeds confidence, Blake finished, knowing the quote well, though originally having heard it under different circumstances. I know. Good. Weiss nodded, picking out an album that Blake had the girl listen to many times before, the songs on it rather pleasant and soulful. Then you should take action and get going for your date. Yes. That I should, Blake replied with a small nod. Have a fun night yourself. You too. Giving the girl one last look to see she was no longer paying her any attention, Blake turned and made her way to the door. Stopping for a brief moment to collect herself as she knew that once she stepped out of the room, there would be no turning back, she closed her eyes and took a deep breath before reaching out and pulling the door open. Giving it one last thought and seeing nothing but the smiling face of the girl that was likely already waiting for her, she felt a small smile pulling at her lips as she opened her eyes and took her first step out of the room.
And that's all for today. Thanks for coming by and hanging out. I hope to see you next time.